Alright, in this video we're going to get our project set up for the sound engine demo. So, to get things kicked off, we're going to start up a new Visual Studio project. We'll make sure that we're using XNA Game Studio 3.1. We'll grab a Windows game for version 3.1, and we will name this project Sound Engine. Sound Engine, we'll let the solution name also be Sound Engine, and we have our basic projects folder as the location. Okay, we'll get all of that created and ready to go.
And we're done.
Now the first thing we need to do is bring in some of our audio assets.
Okay.
We need to get our samples loaded in. Now over here on the hard drive, I have a folder which has some WAV files in it.
Okay.
So we need to get those loaded in, and we'll use those as our base samples. So what we'll do inside of Visual Studio is we'll go up here under the Content subproject, we'll right-click on it, and we'll add a new folder. And we'll call this folder Samples. Now to get all of our audio loaded in, we'll simply drag all of the WAV files from Windows into our Samples folder. And that should get everything copied over. You'll note that if you click on any of these and check out their properties, you'll note that the path ends up being the Visual Studio Projects path. So everything did indeed get copied in. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we need to address the fact that XNA's content pipeline is going to attempt to build each of these WAV files into a type recognized by XNA.
Okay.
Now, for our purposes, we don't actually want this to happen. When we play audio using XNA systems, we will be utilizing XACT. And when we play audio using direct sound, we need the actual WAV files.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
What we're going to do is select all of the WAV files all at once, and we're going to change the build action from compile over to none. And we're also going to change the copy to output directory option from do not copy to
copy if newer. Right.
So now instead of building these, we actually get a direct copy of these WAV files copied to our output folder, meaning our game's actual folder. Alright, now that we have the WAV samples set up, now we need to take a look at XACT. We need to get an XACT project set up with all of this audio data loaded in and ready for use by XNA's audio systems. Now we're going to load up the latest version of XACT, and for the purposes of recording, I don't want to go digging around through all the flyouts in the start menu, so I have simply loaded the directory reflected in the start menu here in Windows.
Yeah, if you got it installed, it's probably in a similar place to here where we've got start menu, programs, Microsoft XNA Game Studio 3.1, and then tools.
Right, so up under here we've got actually both versions of XACT, the older version 2 and the newer version 3. We're going to go ahead and load up the latest as of this recording, which is XACT version 3. So here we'll load in XACT, and now we need to establish a new project.
Now, fundamentally, what is XACT going to allow us to do or create?
Well, basically,
why are we here?
Just a quick refresher for anyone not familiar with the use of XACT. What we're going to do here is set up an audio project which will allow us to reference and describe audio in such a way that is useful to a game.
Okay.
That means we'll do things such as reference original samples. We will then set properties on those samples so we can describe them in terms of a sound. And on top of the sounds, we'll add even additional parameters such as randomization factors and variance. So it's a stage of processes we can apply to sound to make it more friendly in the gaming sense. This includes anything from basic properties up into how the sound should interact in 3D.
All right. So where do we start?
All right, we're going to start by making a new XACT project. Before I jump into the project itself, I do want to take into consideration where this project is going to be placed, since we need to reference it inside of Visual Studio. So before we actually make the project, what I want to do is inside of Visual Studio, up under our Content subproject,
And make an XACT folder.
And add a folder.
Yeah.
And we'll simply call this XACT. So XACT. Just to make sure that this folder exists, and then we can save the XACT project into it. So jumping back over to XACT, we'll jump under here, we'll hit the New Project button on the toolbar, and the first thing that we are asked is where would we like to save this project. You'll notice it's jumped to the path underneath Projects. If you had started out up here at the root, this is the root of the Visual Studio Projects folder, where we have Sound Engine, the actual Sound Engine project, the Content subproject, and finally here are two folders that we were creating. So there is the XACT folder.
Okay.
Now we'll name this project Drums and hit save. You'll notice down here that this resulted in a drums.xap file.
Now, the reason we called it drums as opposed to sounds is just, in this case, that's the kind of sound effects we're bringing in.
Right, this is just our sound sample set. Really, this name could be anything you wanted.
Right.
We're just naming something relatively descriptive for the purpose at hand. It could be drum set, drum bank, whatever
Sure.
you would like. All right, now to get some audio data imported, let's set up a wave bank and a sound bank. So we'll right-click on Wave Bank and create a new wave bank. For the name, we'll leave the name Wave Bank, but we'll erase the space that appears between the two words, just to make the files a little bit easier to handle.
Okay.
And we'll do the same for sound banks. We'll right-click on sound banks, we'll say Add a new sound bank, and we'll erase the space out of there.
And just as a review for those who need it, our wave bank is really just a list of file references, right?
Exactly. This is just where we bring in the raw audio data.
Right.
And then our sound bank is going to contain all of the interesting stuff where we set volume, properties, behaviors, and so on.
Okay.
Now you'll notice that a window out here in the workspace has been created for each, one for the wave bank, one for the sound bank. To make these easier to see, I'm going to jump up to Window, and I'm going to come down to Tile horizontally. Now we have our wave bank on the bottom, and we have our sound bank on the top. Now to get some audio data loaded in, I'm simply going to jump back out to Windows, where we once again have our original wave samples. Now, I do want to be careful about where these samples actually come from. Since this project needs to reference the samples themselves, I would rather not have the project be dependent on external files, where I'm considering the samples folder to be external to the game project.
Right, you want to grab those ones that you copied into the project earlier on, right?
Right, the actual game project lives over here. If we navigate to My Documents, jump under Visual Studio Projects, notice we have Sound Engine. If we jump into Sound Engine, we have our Content subproject, and from here we have samples. And you'll note that the samples were indeed copied.
Yeah.
So I'm actually going to favor this version of the WAV files, because that will establish a reference that is all contained within our project.
That way, if you move your project from one location to another, your sound should come right along.
Exactly. It makes things a lot more convenient. So let's jump back over here. Let me bring our XACT project to the foreground, bring our Visual Studio Project folder to the foreground, grab all these WAV files, and drag them down here to the Wave Bank pane here at the bottom. We'll drop all of these in, and you'll note that all of them get loaded up, and we can see various information about these WAV files.
Sure.
Now that we've got these loaded in, if we wanted to, we could go sample by sample and set them up as sounds and cues, one by one, setting individual properties. In our case, though, these samples have already been prepared for use inside of something like a drumming game. Therefore, we're only interested in getting these names playable inside of XNA.
Okay.
The quickest way we can do that is to select all of them and simply drag them up to the sound bank window underneath the cue pane. So down here under cue name, if we drop these directly into the cue list, XACT will go for us and automatically make the necessary sounds.
Okay.
It's almost like a layered system where you have the original sample, you need a sound to further describe that sample, and then later you can use those sounds to in turn generate cues.
And it figures that if you wanted cues, then they needed to be sounds anyway, and it does the work for you.
Right, so it drops everything in all at once.
Right.
Now, one thing I do want to address is the fact that by default, when a sound gets created, its volume, if we scroll down here on the left a little bit under mixing, you'll notice that its volume is actually set a little bit below 100%. We've got a negative 12 dB drop on the sound. And this is simply XACT trying to be helpful in the case of a normal game where you bring in full, maxed out, normalized audio samples, and you're probably going to be playing a lot of these in your game. If you played them all at once, you would end up overdriving the sound and end up clipping.
Yeah, it's a common thing to actually, when you play them in the game, to have them turned down a little bit so you can stack them.
But once again, in our case, these wave samples have already been prepared for use. That means this additional drop in volume is undesirable. So we're going to grab all of the sounds in the sound bank all at once, and we're going to set their volume to a value of 0 dB, so we have no drop in volume.
So that's not necessarily just their volume, that's kind of like an offset.
Right, that's actually an offset applied to the original.
To their base volume.
And once again, this being one of many things that can be used as you're engineering your various audio samples inside of XACT.
Right.
But with this setup, now we have cue names that are based on sounds that are set to 100% volume. We will go ahead and save out our drums project. And at this point, we can actually close out of XACT. Now back inside of Visual Studio, we need to bring that project in so that our content pipeline can build that project. So we'll right-click on XACT, we'll say Add Existing Item, and we'll jump under the XACT folder, and there is our drums.xap file, or XAP. So we'll load this in. We see drums, and to verify that all is working, both our settings for our WAV files and all of the information contained within our drums project file, we will simply build. So I'll hit the F6 key, let everything build. The build has succeeded. Now just to verify that our copied files got copied correctly, and our built XACT project got built correctly, I'm going to jump back into our projects folder. Right now we're currently up under samples under content, where we navigated to copy in the content folder, or excuse me, content sub-project.
Right.
If we jump up a few levels, here we are back at the main project level. From here we can jump into the bin folder, from there x86, and finally debug.
And there's Sound Engine.
And so here is the output folder for our game, including the game's executable. We can jump into the content folder, and we can see that we do indeed have two folders,
Nice.
samples. Samples contains WAV files, so those successfully copied over. And one level up we have XACT, and we have our main settings file, which was based on the drums project, and we have our sound bank and our wave bank. Also, looking at the size of the wave bank, we appear to have a lot of information.
Right.
We have
Just over a meg.
yeah, just over almost a meg and a half.
Yeah.
And we can actually compare that to the samples and note that 1.36 meg is actually very close in size, which makes sense since this wave bank is containing all of the data that all the samples consisted of.
Very nice.
Now with that has our project set up and ready to go.
So from this point, where do we go next?
Well, from here we're going to move into creating the actual sound engine coming up here in the next video.
All right, sounds good. Well, let's go ahead and jump on into that next.